So, hello again. My name is Mikhailo Gluboki. I'm development director of Svitlana Foundation, and I'm really happy to see you all at our webinar, our event. And this event takes place in frames of data projects, and DATAS is the project dedicated to topics of personal data, technology, and power, especially with a focus on Eastern and Central Europe. And this is the project that we do together with our partners from Goethe Institute in Prague, Meat Factory in Prague, and also Project Atoll in Slovenia and Tallinn Art Hall in Estonia. And the project is funded by Creative Europe program and with the support of New Democracy Fund implemented by the Danish Cultural Institute. We are very happy to see the guests today. We'll announce them in a minute, but I think it's really important to highlight the topic of today's discussion, and this is the situation with data in Ukraine, because this is something that quite well known for people, of course, who live in Ukraine and who follow situation there closely. But for a lot of people, especially from other countries, situation is really less known, especially from the perspective of using of data in the warfare, in filtration on occupied territories, and this had been going since 2014. There's a lot of things that happened, and there are a lot of things that we can look closely, research, and take into consideration for our own experiences. And this is why I'm extremely happy that we have this really stellar constellation of experts presenting their research today. And before I will give the floor to our guests, I will also say that you can ask questions. If you have any questions, please write them in chat here in Zoom, or if you're watching us on other streaming platforms, you can use chat there. We will read questions at the end of the presentation, so we'll have Q&A session. And if you will have questions that you want to ask by voice, you will also be able to raise your hand and join us and ask your questions yourselves. So I introduce Lucy Nichai, who is the creator of our project. And Lucy, please take it away.
Yes, thank you a lot for this evening that you can join us. And also I want to say thank you again, Daria, Svitlana, and Tanya, and Nastya also, because today we have the extension of our residency program, because now we have the next one more talks about the important topic what we start discussed few months ago. And I want to introduce the other speakers. At first, I want to say about Tetyana Lokot is associate professor in digital media and society at Dublin City University, Ireland. She researches authoritarianism, civic agency, and the loss of freedom in the internet age, and is the author of Beyond the Protest Square, Digital Media and Augmented Dissent. Dr. Lokot holds a PhD from the Philip Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland, USA, and previously worked as an associate professor in National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And next, I want to introduce Svitlana Matviyenko, is Associate Professor of Critical Media Analysis of Simon Fraser University School of Communication. Her research focuses on disinformation, cyber war, popular mobilization, critical infrastructure, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and post-colonial decolonial theory. Dr. Matviyenko's current work examines nuclear culture, nuclear colonialism, and weaponization of population and nuclear terror during the Russian war in Ukraine. She is an expert on political economy and cyber warfare and the political ecology of the war. Daria Hetmanova is a PhD candidate at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University, Canada, working at the intersection of science and technology studies and critical security studies. Her research focused on the analysis of the Russian established infrastructure of filtration during the Russian war against Ukraine. She co-authored the paper Production of Subject of Deportation, Filtration Processes During the Russian-Ukraine War with Svitlana Matviyenko, published in Sociologica Journal. And also today with us, the critical tech group. It should be two artists. Yes, Nazar today can't join us, just Nastya Kolotka with us. And critical tech group, it's a group of Ukrainian artists and researchers. They was residents of the DATAS program. They took their independent research about the role of data in state governments and developed the idea of machine state. I think now it looks closer to reality than ever has been. And I think what Nastya will start the discussion after the introduction of the research of each of other experts here. And let's start from Tanya. Very welcome. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much to Lucy, and thanks very much to Mikhailo for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be in such stellar company. So I will kick off our discussion today by introducing some reflections on the research I've been doing on the role of citizens' perception of digital media and digital networks in various socio-political transformations. And I will begin by talking mostly about my previous research, which was looking at the role of citizens' perceptions of digital media tools in political and social protests. A large part of this research was, of course, devoted to Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, as we now know it. But I will also then take a bit of time to talk about how these processes and these understandings of what digital media can do for citizens and also what they can't do for citizens have changed in Ukraine in particular in the past decade, since 2014, and how some of these practices are transforming during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So I hope that that will then kind of bridge nicely into what Daria and Svitlana will talk about. So to begin with, I think just a few things. The Ukrainian part of our audience will probably be familiar with this, but just to kind of set the scene for why we are talking about the important role of digital platforms and digital networks in how citizens fight for their agency. Ukraine is perhaps a very interesting case for this because, on the one hand, it has a very long history of civic network building and resistance, which we know from, well, some of us from our own experience, but also from the multiple histories of resistance and large-scale protest movements. But we also know that Ukrainian citizens have long relied on the openness and power of horizontal networks to mobilize for collective action. And in fact, some of the strength that has built up in Ukrainian civil society is there exactly because citizens have traditionally been kind of suspicious and sometimes distrustful of centralized authority. So they've kind of gotten used to fighting for their rights and fighting for their freedoms alongside or away from centralized authority. And obviously, the example we always talk about is the Revolution of Dignity, which in a way was not just transformative for Ukrainian political life, but also for Ukrainian civil society, because it spurned a new civic ethos of activism and participation that wasn't necessarily based on political ideology first and foremost, but on the values of individual freedom, responsibility, and dignity. So we have a very vibrant civil society, which sets the scene really nicely. But the other thing that has happened in the past decade is this shift to more fluid, more informal, more horizontal, and more diverse forms of civic activism, and the power, in particular, of personalized everyday acts of citizenship and civic agency, and also the really important role of networks, platforms, and all sorts of digital tools that various researchers have been looking into, including myself. And this particular connection between civic activity, citizen practices, and digital tools and digital media has been really exploding in terms of how much research there has been about it in the last 5 years. Unfortunately, also because of the Russian full-scale invasion. So there is now a growing body of work on citizen digital media use for all kinds of things, but also citizen representation on digital media in occupation, while displaced, in diasporic networks, and on the front line. So we have this pervasive presence of digital media and social networks in our lives, but we're also becoming used to it as a tool of gaining more agency and as a tool of resistance and as a tool of fighting for our civic and political rights. Obviously, this is not without some tension. And so my research in particular has focused in the past decade first on what people see as opportunities afforded to them by digital media for resistance, but also what constraints they see and what limitations on their civic agency do they see digital media posing. So in particular, my book documents one such large project, which is a multimodal ethnography of the protest and the events in Kyiv in particular, where I observed how people were using technology in context, but also not using it, and why. And it also consists of extensive interviews that I conducted with protesters in various parts of the protest square and outside of it. And so this idea of augmented resistance or augmented dissent is essentially to capture that protest isn't just material, nor is it just digital. It actually happens in somewhere in between in the hybrid spaces, and those elements of material and digital reality are closely entangled. So this was kind of the main idea behind the book. And then the other main idea was that it's not just opportunities. There are massive limitations and massive barriers that citizens have when they attempt to use digital media to fight for their rights. And that has translated nicely into my research during the recent 5 years, 4 years in particular, looking at how networked citizen practices, in particular those that we can think about as resistance, have transformed in response to the full-scale Russian aggression and invasion in this intensely mediated war. Of course, there are massive changes that have happened in the past decade. First of all, our lives, our everyday lives have become much more digitized, much more datafied. Our existence is kind of steeped in all kinds of data that we share, that we provide, that we are expected to give up. But at the same time, we are much more aware of the effects and kind of ordinary citizens, even people who don't necessarily spend all of their time on social media, they're much more aware of the presence of digital media and digital tools, but not necessarily aware of some of the barriers or some of the less civically inclined aspects of what happens to our data on social media platforms. So there is still a gap in terms of media literacy and digital literacy among the average kind of citizens, and there's a spectrum of what people know or don't know. And so the research that I've been doing over the past several years is again ethnographic work to look at citizens' online media practices, how they incorporate the daily reality of war into their digital media routines, but also what they do with the things that social media allow them to do, documenting their experiences, expressing their emotions and affect, using it to witness and to be witnesses to the unfolding events of Russia's aggression, but also the attempting then to kind of systematize and categorize the different uses. And so just to give you a kind of subset of ideas that I've been pulling through my research from the protest period to the war period, is that when we talk about opportunities that social media or digital networks offer to people for developing agency or gaining more agency, it very often depends on a very context-specific combination of material, affective, and digital elements. And so again, we shouldn't forget that context matters not just in the sense of how much internet access do you have or how many social networks are you on, but it also depends on very material things like how many hours a day do you have electricity, and also how comfortable are you expressing yourself and sharing very personal things on particular social networks. But we also know that this is becoming more normalized. So the work of expressing opinions, the work of sharing information, the work of being active in digital spaces is expected from people as citizens. And, Ethan and Rupert say that in fact, digital acts and network spaces bring people into being as citizens, but also as subjects to power and subjects of power. So it's never just that social media are democratic and then give people a whole range of new opportunities. They also make us subject to the power that other more powerful actors can exert over us. And in a way, we can see digital networks as dual use technologies because they afford opportunities and limitations for people trying to resist, whether it's resisting an autocratic regime or resisting an aggressor trying to occupy their country and eradicate their society. Because there's a variety of actors who are exploiting and weaponizing these affordances that digital networks offer for their own needs. And so this agency of citizens in network spaces is an object of constant contestation by states, by platforms, by other actors, and in fact by other citizens as well. So in the context of moving from, the scene of protest as kind of the pivotal democratic act, and in Ukraine's case, a very real act of democratic transformation, we go into a scenario of participatory warfare where for all kinds of actors involved in the war, even actors who are based outside of Ukraine, there are opportunities for participating in the war and in the everyday warfare that are very digitally mediated and that are intense because they're greatly expanded. So even people who are not very close to the front line can experience certain things, about what it's like to be in a country that is being attacked every day. But obviously still kind of not in the same way as people who are directly affected by it. So we look at this through the prism of digital citizenship or networked citizenship, because again, the things we do in digital spaces are increasingly more important for our kind of civic self-understanding, for our recognition of ourselves as citizens, but also this constant tension between our desire to practice citizenship in everyday life, including in digital spaces, and the tension between that and socio-technical changes in states and platform power, where states are also concerned about digital sovereignty and they seek to impose their own rules and limitations on who and how can practice producing content and exchanging opinions in digital spaces, but also platforms whose business model is to collect and sell our data, and for whom it is also very important to impose their own constraints and to impose their own rules on what we do on their platforms, but also to keep us on those platforms for as long as possible and to get us to produce and share as much as they can. So in terms of the affordances of digital media for resistance, I will give you an example of this kind of dual use of digital media, and this is the idea of visibility. So we know obviously that for a lot of people who were not in Ukraine during the Revolution of Dignity, the first time they may have learned about what was going on was thanks to widespread visual and textual documentation practices that a lot of civic media and individual citizens were engaging in online. So visibility for protesters that was offered by digital media tools was seen as a key affordance, and it was often used strategically by protesters to achieve their protest aims. And when it became strategic, that visibility also changed their experience of witnessing because they were conscious that everything they were recording or documenting was an act of witnessing, which was then available to other people. And it therefore affected how meaning, memories, and protest histories were made. But at the same time, we know that mediated visibility also makes protesters more vulnerable. And especially in authoritarian contexts, it has been exploited. That ability to record, to live stream, to document has been exploited by authoritarian actors to surveil, control, undermine, and discredit the resistance. And even during the Revolution of Dignity, we saw some examples of that, where protesters were hunted down and their locations were, visible on social media, and then, there were some dire consequences because of this. But in terms of how this changes, for instance, in the time we are in now during Russia's full-scale invasion, is that it's very clear that digital mediated visibility is a key component of participatory warfare. Because these everyday acts of documenting people's lived experiences and witnessing the impacts of aggression are becoming central to the process of how we produce knowledge about the war, of how Ukrainians who are experiencing attacks, experiencing deprivation, experiencing power outages, they're able to produce knowledge about what it's like and to share that knowledge and make it visible up to and including through digital media. But also this strategic visibility work is now made much more complex because today it involves not just managing attention, but also a lot of other labor. It involves, for instance, debunking disinformation or false claims, and also pushing against the constant epistemic suspicion that, because you're Ukrainians, you're obviously biased. So the rest of the world can't trust Ukrainians to talk about what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. So this is, in a nutshell, what epistemic suspicion is. And at the same time, the other thing that citizens have to fight against is that precariousness of visibility, because at any time the visibility of their content might be minimized or might become zero, either because somebody marked it as sensitive content or because the algorithmic logics decided that, this is not potentially viral, so we're just not going to show it to people in their feeds. So this pushing back requires constant everyday grassroots labor. The other example of the kinds of affordances that citizens can get potentially by using digital media is this idea of narrative continuity and maintaining a certain set of narratives about the events, that they're involved in, be it a protest or a war. During the Revolution of Dignity, when a lot of social media were already quite well developed, but weren't necessarily nearly the powerhouses that they are now, the affordances of making content scalable and persistent through social media infrastructures enabled people to share information, frame events that were happening in a particular way, but also to construct narratives within the protest, and then to also make sure those narratives were legible and that they persisted outside to broader networks, including abroad. This is obviously very important during the full-scale invasion as well. But today, citizen agency doesn't just stem from producing narratives, but also in a way from being able to reframe mainstream political or military narratives around micro experiences, around people's everyday lives, personal histories. So this ability to recontextualize the effective and mundane nature of documenting war-related repression, violence, or suffering is seen as very important, but also in a way to show that that is not necessarily somehow suspect or that these narratives are biased, but instead the struggle is to present them as rational and legitimate. So it's a very different battle than from just struggling to make sure that information about your event, your protest persists. It's more important not only that it persists, but that it also is recontextualized to account not just for geopolitical grand narratives, but also the small-scale experiences of ordinary people. And so what changes here is because the political, social, and technological context has changed, whereas in my research and my interviews with participants of the Revolution of Dignity, many more people were, if not optimistic, then at least carefully neutral and mostly positive about the potential affordances of digital media. And these their experiences were that they saw that these networks helped them to explore, to bridge different communities, and to expand the knowledge about the events. During the full-scale invasion, many more interviewees and many more digital media users are now very conscious that they are living in an environment where both the network sphere and the physical landscape have been impacted by authoritarian interventions, occupation, warfare, sometimes infrastructural destruction. And so social media affordances has become a site of contestation. They're not necessarily seen as positive. And the contestation is between ordinary citizens who are fighting for agency and sovereignty, but also between states who are seeking control over battlefields and attention, and platforms who are seeking to reap more profits from more data and more emotionally charged content. So this contributes to the change where a lot more citizens who are involved in the resistance effort, one way or the other, are seeing the need to be more strategic, but also they see these affordances as survival oriented. They don't just see them as a nice bonus, they see them as central to kind of the survival of their country and their own survival. But they're also acutely aware that this work is hard everyday work that demands a combination of epistemic, effective, narrative, and algorithmic resistance tactics. So when we talk about epistemic resistance, right, we mean that people understand that everything they publicly post or share on social media is potentially an act of participatory knowledge production. So the kinds of things people are used to doing is, for instance, sharing embodied knowledge and lived experiences of the war, but also framing an agenda setting, which, you know, we traditionally think of as terms that, oh, this is the work that journalists do. But no, we are all micro media, as one of my interviewees put it, and we're all working to reframe the narratives, not just into, you know, should you trust us about our own experiences, but even narratives about what is this war about? What is the reason for this war? Why is it happening? And so this constant work of curating, reframing, correcting the words that people use, talking about the historical and the political context is mundane everyday work. Alongside this work, people are also using digital media to document, preserve evidence, share records. Obviously, some of these records are not preserved for public consumption. They're preserved for future justice and accountability, but quite a lot of these collections and records are also being shared in public space. And then obviously assigning blame and responsibility, which is a very important function of how knowledge is shaped. There's acute awareness among the people I interviewed that the work they do is very problematic, and there's a tension between participatory knowledge production that people are expected to do, and the fact that it is actually really difficult and it's really painful. So these are some of the quotes from my interviewees where, you know, they understand that turning their grief into content is actually really, really painful, and it's a struggle. And the fact that, you know, even when we try to honor and grieve for the people who have died or have been killed in combat, this is also seen as an act of sort of content production, which is again acutely problematic. So in a way, the recognition that this is very difficult emotional work is also worth recognizing, and the fact that, the normality and the normalization of kind of what we call sensitive content is at once very difficult and very laborious, but it is also necessary in order to legitimize this content as not as something that needs to be hidden by, a blur that says sensitive content or that needs to be taken off the platform, but that is something that actually needs to come across people's feeds. And so that, even very high level emotions like anger or grief or rage are framed to be seen as just and not irrational. And in the same way, the use of crowd-driven accountability mechanisms that has become very widely known in Ukrainian digital media circles is there to, again, normalize the work of calling out those who engage in acts of corruption or abuses of trust or other transgressions, but also to normalize emotionality and to normalize emotional expression as part of the knowledge sharing that happens during wartime. And the final thing that I'll focus on is this idea of algorithmic resistance, this idea that it's not just enough to produce content and to manage how this content is shared or spread, to make sure this knowledge is actually visible to people, but you also then have to do the work of making sure that you're fighting against the algorithms and that you actually understand what the algorithm is doing in terms of making your content visible or invisible, simply because in most social media platforms, we are now seeing that algorithms are playing a very hidden but very important role of surfacing particular narratives. So we've seen a lot of examples of this kind of work pushing against algorithms and metrics, pushing against strategic use of complaint and moderation tools, but also using those same tools to, for instance, debunk disinformation, and also calling out coordinated astroturfing or bot campaigns that spread misinformation and subvert adversarial algorithmic logics. So I'll finish by just remarking on a few challenges for digital media as potential avenues for civic agency. Obviously, achieving visibility when you are trying to resist occupation, aggression, and war is very difficult. And it's difficult because on the one hand, you need to stress emotionality and individual experience, but on the other hand, you still need to be able to legitimize those individual lived experiences. It's also difficult because most organized disinformation operations are supported by spending power, while citizen resistance typically is not, and it depends very much on horizontal mobilization skills. And it's kind of part of the overall trend of algorithmic injustice where citizens are constantly pushing against platform power. It's also really difficult to build trust and solidarity in a network where there is pre-existing misinformation trauma and where disinformation and geopolitical narratives have very high durability. But I think, and I'll leave you with this thought, it's very important to penetrate and rearrange these dominant hierarchies and infrastructures of knowledge, data, and attention that are shaped by hegemonic power actors. Because even though it's particularly challenging, it's really, really important in order for resistance to have any effect and in order for citizen agency to have a bigger space in these networked spaces. Thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think it's very symbolic today to speak in Eva to the Day of Dignity in Ukraine, 21st of November. We celebrate some kind of revolution, day of starting of revolution, and also we call this Day of Dignity. And also I want to invite Daria to add another perspective to that. It means perspective of assault of dignity. Yes, it's something what we want to share now. Daria, very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for introduction, and Tetyana, that was very interesting. It's one of my interests, so I was excited to hear this. and looking forward to the discussion. Yes. So today I'm going to speak about my ongoing research, which is part of the broader project. And the part which I'm going to focus now is concentrated around the question of how Ukrainian civilians are rendered as knowable and legible under the Russian occupation. Centering it as a guiding question, I will be looking into the practices, devices, and scenes which are recruited into the production of the subject under occupation as knowable and legible not only to the Russian occupying forces and Russian state in turn, but also simultaneously to the civil epistemic actors in Ukraine and internationally. I will start with talking about how my project started. So this project where I analyze the Russian established infrastructure of filtration started back in spring 2022, where together with Svitlana Matviyenko, we began a series of interviews with Natalia, a resident of one of the villages in Mariupol, who was forcibly transferred to the territory of the Russian Federation in the middle of March. Our aim of this project was to theorize and document the effects of filtration on different levels, from the very bodily experience of fear and suppression prior to filtration, which started from the Russian siege of Mariupol, to Natalia's overall perception of her personhood, which was completely shattered by the filtration process. After speaking with Natalia and thinking together with her, we decided to broaden the time frame of filtration process to the different logistical steps which preceded filtration and followed it as well. And I break down those infrastructural and logistical steps a little bit later. In the paper which came out as a result of this work, we spoke of filtration as a complex and prolonged process which aimed to correlate the data collected from Ukrainian civilians' devices with biometric data collected during the inspection of their bodies to instrumentalize and reify deported civilians as data subjects. Currently, I'm continuing this line of work by asking the question of where filtration starts and where it ends. Who are the actors involved in this process? Who are its targets? What are its aims? And finally, what does it even refer to? The answers to this question would change drastically if we, depending on whether we speak of Russian infrastructure filtration, let's say in March 2022, shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, or in October 2023, when filtration system started to target those who were and trying to reach Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine rather than leave them. This question also points to one of the main arguments or hypotheses I make in my broader research project is that filtration infrastructure is not static. It's been constantly repurposed with its operational logics changing during its every new iteration. I should note also that as of now, my research on filtration focuses on the experiences of residents from Mariupol and nearby areas who passed through it back in March 2022. So both the timeline and the form of these changes might look very different if we included, for example, the experience of people trying to leave Russian-occupied territories of, let's say, Kharkiv or Kherson Oblast. So this is the picture which I sometimes use. It's generalized logistics of forced transfer of Ukrainian civilians based on the route of civilian from Mariupol, which was made by the team of investigators from Yale-based Conflict Observatory Lab. back in August 2022. We learned of existence of filtration camps back in March 2022 from the witness accounts who directly referred to them as filtration camps. And according to the US Department of State, who also used a broad range of data, the number of forcibly transferred, interrogated, and detained civilians during this process, so not every one of them passed through all this, through all the logistical steps which are shown on this map, is between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainian civilians, including children as well. In the accounts which were published, in the witness accounts which were published, filtration camps turned out to be physical sites or facilities operated in the Russian-occupied parts of Donetsk Oblast. At these facilities, Ukrainian civilians, in many cases, either forcibly transferred to the Russian territory or forced to evacuate in the direction of Russia due to blocked evacuation routes towards Ukraine, were screened by people with no insignia. However, in the report published by the Center for Grand Strategy at King's College London, journalists and scholars, experts on the Russian surveillance practices, Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan, mentioned that this operation were supported by the military counterintelligence department of the Russian Federal Security Services. During the screening process, Ukrainian civilians underwent a round of questioning while their biometric data in the form of fingerprinting, palm printing, first photographing, as well as the user data from their personal devices being extracted. If at any of this point they could be deemed rendered as suspicious, quote, they could face physical abuse in the forms of torture, beatings, or extrajudicial detention. Based on the published reports, as well as our conversations with Natalia, the general logistics of the forced transfer of Ukrainian civilians to Russian territory were organized in the following way. Filtration sites were located on the way to the territory of the Russian Federation, and for Ukrainian civilians forcibly transferred there, passing through filtration was a prerequisite for entering Russia, where another round of this time selective interrogations were carried out by the Russian FSB border security service. And afterwards, those who were allowed to enter Russia were transported to the so-called temporary accommodation centers, with their final destinations sometimes being revealed only during the train journey. Due to the lack of documents left in besieged Mariupol, Natalia's family member, Oksana, with her story well documented by Politico magazine as well, which is titled One Family Perilous Journey through the Russian filtration camps. Due to the lack of documents left in besieged Mariupol, Oksana and her children needed to undertake this train route to what they learned later was Vladimir, temporary accommodation center in Vladimir. During her time in the temporary accommodation center, while she was trying to find a way to leave Russia, she and her children went through at least 4 more interrogations with different either governmental officials or at least one time with the agents from the Russian Federal Security Service. She spent about a month there and was able to leave as many other Ukrainian civilians without documents through the route which was available at the time. Very risky and expensive, but at least it was an option, which is also very which was halted at some point as well. Those who managed to refuse traveling to these centers and move independently within Russia, a possibility that was very limited since Ukrainian citizens inside Russia had little access to money exchange or banks, making even buying a train ticket quite difficult, were required to declare their destination and provide contact information of those they would be staying with to the Russian FSB officers at the border between Russian Federation and the so-called Donetsk People Republic. Leaving Russia for Europe also required a so-called interview with the agent from the FSB border service, who recorded their final destination abroad, as well as the contacts and addresses of relatives who remained in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. Some civilians also report being strip-searched or subjected to another round of interrogation before being allowed to leave Russia, as in the case of Oksana, Natalia's aunt. Natalia, our interlocutor, passed through the filtration camp in Bezymene, a small village near Mariupol, which is about 30-minute ride and which was occupied since 2014. And when you search for the information on filtration, the satellite image of these tents made by Maxar, US-based space company, is one of the most widely circulated and among the few possible visualizations. And I guess in part, these images also contributed to the public imaginary and understanding of filtration as being bound to a very specific place, as, for instance, Bezymene village. Yet Bezymene is also just one part of the broader network of Russian filtration facilities established in 2022, among 21 others identified by the Yale-based conflict observatory team, dispersed across Donetsk Oblast and serving different purposes, sometimes one of them, sometimes all three simultaneously: registration, holding, or detention. The conflict observatory defines filtration as specific to data collection processes in Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine, as a multi-step system that Russia and its proxies have deployed to register, interrogate, and in some cases indefinitely detain people residing in areas at the time Russia and its allied forces took control of. This is their description. However, by examining this brief glimpse of filtration logistics, driven mostly from Natalia's experience, partly from her family, as well as from the interviews with volunteers who assisted deported Ukrainians to leave Russia for Europe, which is also part of my data collection process for this project. This route, of course, could look a bit different for everyone. At the same time, I argue that filtration operates beyond its physical materialization, as we can see in this picture, in Russian-occupied Donetsk Oblast, extending with the bodies of Ukrainian civilians and the digital devices they carry as far as the trains they've put on travel, and the temporality of it could be also extended even further when they leave the Russian state as well. I will broadly speak on the changes in filtration infrastructure since its onset in 2022. I must say that it's not an exhaustive map of these changes, rather just a short glimpse in what I find important to kind of demonstrate how from this very specific and concentrated in specific space and time process, it became this network with this process which does not have territorial boundaries or became just a part of bureaucratic system. Shortly in the summer of 2022, shortly after the Russian occupation of Mariupol, filtration became a prerequisite for mobility under occupation. And for this, I mean that if a person wanted to move inside occupied city or inside occupied Mariupol, or to leave Mariupol and to travel to the neighboring regions, neighboring cities and villages, this person would need to pass through filtration first, get a stamp, and this time filtration was conducted in administrative facilities framed in pretty much bureaucratic language in the former police department in occupied Mariupol. And quite short after this time, I guess maybe by the end of summer, it's difficult to establish these concrete timelines at this point. It became also a part of the requirement to get a Russian passport. And I think that it's important to say that when we speak that filtration became a prerequisite for mobility inside the city, it's not only about the access to be able to travel inside the city. This was the time when people needed to get an access or to rebuild certain techno-social infrastructure in the form of gas, water networks, electricity. So the very access to those kind of like life maintaining infrastructures was also dependent on the filtration. In October 2023, the system was further formalized, now targeting Ukrainian civilians who wanted to enter the Russian occupied territories of Ukraine. And there was signed a decree on the special procedure for the entry of Ukrainian citizens into the territory of Russia from third country, and now entrance, the available route to the Russian occupied territories became only through either Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow suburbs or through the online border with Latvia. And Latvia shortly closed this border after this decree was announced. And since that time, Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport became it started to function as a filtration facility in a way. How did it operate? People who people would either take and would go through online land border with Belarus, going through pre-filtration process at the Belarus border control point. And in this case, it's also interesting how the filtration became externalized to Belarus, with possibility to being banned from the further travel by the Belarusian border control officers. If they're allowed to travel further, they would take a plane from Minsk airport to Moscow Sheremetyevo airport, where they would encounter another process of filtration, which is pretty much similar to the one which was back in 2022, yet we can see that there are new procedures added. For instance, now it also involves collection of the DNA as well. In Sheremetyevo Airport, they could also be denied entrance, and then possibility to travel to the Russian occupied territories and being banned from this for up to 50 years. And looking into the devices which are working on this process of making Ukrainian civilians as knowable and legible, I'm thinking about statistics. There was an amazing paper by Ukrainian sociologist Lydia Kozemska published in 2000 25, where Lydia made a very tedious and important work by looking onto not only the published statistics of the number of war displaced Ukrainians in Russia, published by, for instance, Russian state-aligned media TASS, claiming that the total number of refugees who have arrived in Russian Federation from the territory of Ukraine and Donbass since February has exceeded 4.5 million people, including 745,000 children. Kuzemska also looked into the very production of statistics and comparing it with other available sources. She notes that this inflated and unverified number of border crossings between Ukraine and Russia, provided moreover only by the Russian side, wrongfully transformed into the number of supposedly real individual Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion in the direction of the aggressor state. And she concludes that a more realistic estimate of the number of Ukrainian citizens displaced to Russia since the full-scale invasion is neither 4.5 million nor 2.85 million, but rather 1 million people at most. We can see that here statistics as a supposedly objective device, and we know that it is not through the much work in STS and sociology of knowledge, play an important role in constructing the political legibility of displaced residents of Mariupol, where the very number of those entering Russia is turned into the equivalent of a very much agential political choice. One of the work Kuzemska also conducts in this paper is that she looks into the media discourse around the terms which were chosen to name Ukrainians who for displaced Ukrainians in Russia, which was, for instance, pointing out that it was mostly used as, they were mostly named as refugees, arriving persons, people accepted by the Russian Federation, evacuees, forced settlers, and maybe if you have watched the debates around the terminology back in March 2022, at that point, it was not a stabilized notion how to name war displaced Ukrainians in Russia. And so that was some sort of process of negotiation and very much political work in reframing their portrayals as refugees to the forcibly deported or forcibly transferred people, as we say now. So when reconstructing the logistics of Natalia's forced transfer to the Russian Federation, we can already identify different actors involved into this process. For instance, a specific department of the Russian Federal Security Service, Russian forces and their proxies as conflict observatory rights. Yet when speaking with her and simultaneously cross-reading visual and textual materials that appeared in Russian state-aligned media shortly after the forced transfer of Ukrainian civilians began, I realized that this list should also include what Foucault identifies as agents of welfare, workers whose work is primarily associated with providing so-called care. And in this way, I would include, for instance, personal workers from the so-called Donetsk People Republic Ministry of Emergency Situation, or MCS, which Natalia also recalled in our conversation and pointed out. But I would argue that through the presence of these supposedly humanitarian workers, which is intended to represent care for deported Ukrainian civilians, a public discourse constructed by the Russian state online media around filtration and forced deportation was trying to was reorganizing the terms through using through the constructing the public imagery around refugee registration and forced transfer as evacuation. And this is a photograph which is very much, there are a lot of them with, I try to use the photograph which does not portray people who were deported, but it's themselves, because there is this kind of like a big right visual archive almost, where people are accepting the aid from during the filtration, with their faces visible. And one of the photographs which also struck my attention is that these are the filtration tents which we can see on the satellite image. And maybe it is not that seen from this very small photograph, but we see that the only person with very much visible insignia which we can identify is the MTS worker with his label on his form. And here is also one of the, I would say, most kind of account of one of the people who passed through filtration at that point, published in Russian state aligned media TASS, which is kind of exemplary for another accounts which appeared during this time. I read this scene along with my broader research on the politics of gratitude, or the politics of constructing the image of the grateful refugee, which is also connected to my ongoing research on the so-called reconstruction of infrastructure in Russian-occupied Mariupol. If you remember, or maybe if you have seen this discourse, there was a lot of images where the footage at the beginning in 2000 of Russian occupation in 2022, where the local residents of Mariupol were being portrayed as the main recipients of humanitarian aid, where infrastructure became the sort of completely depoliticized, and the very notion of political was removed through reframe it as in humanitarian terms. And within this limited political repertoire available to local residents under occupation, this gesture or the emotion of gratitude, which was depicted, expressed through the acceptance of humanitarian aid, was mediated also as a signal of political legibility of city residents, where they were, which is something that I read along the lines of constructing the figure of the grateful refugee as well. So yeah, I would like to end here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Daria, especially for your transforming the data into academic knowledge. It's very important to Ukraine now to have the especially academic knowledge about what happens right now. And also we're now today talking about the quite scary things, human existence and another aspect in the state of the war. And I think what Svitlana can reveal with that topic, yes, and give us a more perspective about what happens or maybe what will happen in a very close future. Thank you, Daria, and welcome, Svitlana.
Hi, everyone. I hope you hear me all right. Yes. So I want to thank the organizers and my co-presenters for this incredibly rich and heavy discussion. So my heart was just totally jumping out, I must say. And every time it does so when I hear all about this, with all this long context and shorter kind of temporal cases, etc. So again, thank you. And I just want to mention from the very beginning that I guess if I had to guess why I'm speaking in this context of information, data, war, security, weaponization of any kind of elements related to the war infrastructure, I would say it's probably because in the past I did some work on rethinking or theorizing the notion of cyber war, which with my co-author Nigdar Wisford, we took away from security specialists, which was kind of their domain, and took it into political economic dimension, where we spoke about cyber war beyond states and expanded, as already Tanya mentioned in her presentation, right? So we see these conflicts, small conflicts and bigger wars, and other mobilizations, resistances, and other things like this, very much beyond, state agents, where state still participates, but it's certainly not the only interested party or party who participates in surveillance, suppression, and so on. So these are corporations, these are also random actors, they are solo actors and bigger communities that all participate in this extremely complicated, complex media event of cyber war. And in this sense, that's how we interpreted this notion in our book, which was also sparkled by, the events of 2014 Maidan, because that's where indeed so many things become at the same time exciting and extremely scary and problematic. So the book also exists in Ukrainian translation for Ukrainian audiences. And now I, of course, and also what's important there in this book, and that's how we were also quite different from every, writer who wrote about cyber war before. We thought of cyber war is really exceeding any kind of cyber or virtual or network dimension. We did think about trenches, and we emphasized that the cyber war that is coming, or maybe already is there, and we wrote it in 2015-19, the cyber war would take place in trenches. The cyber war is about bloodshed, actual bloodshed, and automatization of the warfare. So with this work behind me and observing closely the events of the recent years after the full-scale invasion, I got specifically interested in the dimension of nuclear, and what's happening on what I now identify is the intersection, the nexus of cyber and nuclear. And that's where kind of my new project grows from. And nuclear there is, of course, the ultimate edge of a certain material environment, right? But I'm interested in environment broadly, and that's where I'm taking you today to think about environment and ecologized or environmental warfare, which I think, like any war, should be thought through or thought about today. So it might come as a little unexpected, perhaps, if I start drawing now this kind of the landscape of theories that I bring in conversation about war environments, where data is just one of the elements. But this is how I think of what I identify as terror environment and the data subjects that this terror environment produces. And here I'm, of course, understanding subjects, not necessarily those who express their agental kind of nature, but in fact split, divided, confused, and without having the kind of clear access of what is happening within this environment that constrains them, that produces them, and etc. It's very, again, psychoanalytic understanding of subjects rather than like liberal kind of theories portray subject who is active and object is kind of like inactive, right? So here subject is in fact split agency, confusion, fear, and many other things associated with this. So since we already speak about terror environment, so let's just very briefly note a couple of things about terror. So here I rely on one of theories of terror, who is in very Charles Townshend, who is in a very small book on terrorism, actually made a very important observation. And this observation has to do about the relation of terror and warfare. And he says that they are related intimately, in fact. But the essence of terrorism, in contrast to war, he says, is really the negation of combat. So terror, if you wish, it's an extension of war, where a certain technology cannot, the complexity of war infrastructure cannot be expanded, but maybe some of the technologies can. So terror is basically war delivered where it is not expected, kind of, necessarily. And then if you speak about the environment, it's what important for me here is actually to think about a complexity that is obviously there when we speak about subjects of war, but it's not often considered somehow. And this is complex, this Tanya already mentioned about materialities of those kind of spheres where subjects operate. So she mentioned the lack of electricity, for example, right? So, but this is one of those that we directly link to, how information or signal flows. But I also consider other materialities that we do not link necessarily and immediately to the spheres occupied by the data subjects. They can be smell, the condition of air, they can be sound, and all sort of things, or cold, in fact, temperature, right? So what forms the terror environment is the complexity of all those things, including the information flow and all the mechanisms of its control, distribution, surveillance, and so on. And this kind of understanding really was shaped when I was in 22 and 23 in Ukraine, caring after my parents, and somehow became, as many of us did, the experts speaking to many Western media about the situation on the ground. And I was really surprised how often I was asked the question about how people perceive information, or very often as expert of misinformation, I was asked this question about Russian citizens, right? So why do you think Russian citizens are, or how are they misinformed or disinformed, or what this and that? So I was kind of trying to explain many things about perception of information by Ukrainian users, and the kind of speculating about some other, realms and practices of disinformation, for example, in Russia. And then I kind of was perplexed suddenly that I realized that all these questions come from an understanding that as even information operates in a vacuum, as even it's literally just about regulation, surveillance, right? So, but we purely kind of speak about the information itself, but without this complexity, without indeed hearing or sensing something, or having the lack of water, or hearing explosions, and so on. Because it is these conditions, I realized, sometimes make people perceive something as truth, because thinking that something is true is very often a matter of choice. And that kind of understanding like as a choice in the sense that someone just, let's say in the occupied territories, for example, a choice to maintain one's sanity, kind of to believe, okay, this is the reality that invaded me, and I kind of act as even I believe it, as even this is true. And so with all these constraints that somehow participate in formation of certain behaviors in terms of, again, information perception and also information production became quite interesting for me. And now we will very briefly go through certain important references that impacted my thinking, which never brought, of course, in conversation about information environments, but I think they are important. And for me, it is very important to be very, correct, let's say, or very aware of certain basic meanings, right? So understanding of certain terms. So that is also has to do with the notion of environment. And I want to remind you that all of the thinkers who contributed to this modern understanding of environment, most of them were in the 19th century, and the notion, of course, linked to, sorry, not 1928, but 1828, so apologies. So from Thomas Carlyle to first scientists who register certain communication between system and so on, to someone like Volodymyr Vernadsky, right? So who in fact at first spoke about biosphere in a very complex, in fact, notion of environment, which we can also reinterpret through Vernadsky biosphere, and very often forgotten his notion of noosphere, which has to do with technologies and how knowledge is distributed and how knowledge participates and even weaponized. So I'm still working through with this context to bring them in conversation. So now I'm just mentioning them in passing, but my biggest inspiration was, of course, the work of Peter Sloterdijk, a contemporary German sociologist and philosopher, who made this very interesting, provocative kind of a statement that the notion, despite already being kind of in circulation in philosophy for 100 years, he said the discovery, the real discovery of environment happened in the trenches of World War I. And there he spoke, of course, about chemical warfare, right? So, and referred to the work, practical and theoretical, of Fritz Haber, who was the head of German chemical warfare program and wrote the most famous book on chemical warfare, which is Poisonous Cloud. And in my work, in fact, I want to kind of parallel these ideas, chemical warfare and information or cyber warfare. Not only parallel because they in fact contribute quite interesting, ideas and understandings of what constitutes this poisonous environment, but I also want to see them kind of intermingled, right? So as I was already trying to explain, my environment and in terror environment is in fact both has a certain chemical composition, physical composition, and informational composition. That's why Sloterdijk also says that all wars that have been happening since World War I were ecologized wars. And here, ecology is a very important term, and that's where I also rely on fantastic book, Savage Ecology, and overall work of Jarius Grove, who speaks about a particular kind of ecology that expands by martial assemblages, such as soldiers, tanks, uniforms, gas masks, rations, bullets, and so on. So all of it, right? So in modernity, kind of, war as one of the major kind of like acts, right? So war conditions, inventions, and even so-called progress. So in a certain way, we live in the world saturated by military object, by military ecologies. So it's not just they are brought in by war. Those elements of these military assemblages exist already, and they are very quickly mobilized, right? So, and used for any type of warfare. I do also use the notion of atmospheres introduced by Böhme, but I distinguish it from environments in the sense that when I speak about atmospheres of these different materialities, they are mostly to describe the conditions of lived environment and how it feels to be there, how it feels to be embedded, right? So it's the matter of relation, and that's essentially what ecology is. It's all about particular matter of relations. But environments describe again the material conditions, and they name all the elements there. And that's what is very important for me to explain what elements are there and what technologies constitute the environments. So here I also rely on a wonderful work by Yuriko Futurata, Climatic Media, that speaks about, in conversation with Sloterdijk again, that speaks about territorial understanding of the atmosphere. So she starts from the whole idea of atmospheric control and goes back into kind of military thinking and, thinking of inventing technologies of suppression that actually had to do by controlling the volumes, territorializing them, as she says. And if we use this notion of territorialization of atmosphere, that's of course in conversation with British geographer and sociologist Stuart Eldon, who kind of draws our attention to the notion of territory and how territory really became voluminous in the 21st century. So the battlefield itself is no longer a field, right, but a space. He relies on Virilio also when he speaks about that. And here, since part of my work is also about pollution, and sometimes I refer to weaponization of pollution, right? So I also go to the scholarship that looks into colonial dimension of pollution and rendering certain territories as pollutable. And here specifically Max Le Barillon, Canadian scholar who wrote a fantastic book, Pollution is Colonialism. So that brings another dimension of this war, which obviously has a colonial and imperial dimension, right? So in the attitude and strategies are quite recognizable in terms of that. So again, very briefly, Stuart Eldon and his understanding of a territory, which he distinguished from land and terrain. So he actually speaks that the territory is itself a technology. So if we say that something is territorialized, it means that it's kind of operationalized as well for particular goal and for particular purpose. A number of thinkers, and I'm very briefly kind of give an example of those who operate or work on the intersection of media and infrastructure studies and environmental philosophy, like Eva Horn from Vienna, who speaks about air and air being then often weaponized elemental media and also environing media as the mediums that creates or constitutes certain environments. Of course, Melody Yu, who speaks about the water as medium and milieu that creates certain conditions of possibility and even politics within certain outlined realms. Tina Harris speaks about border itself as environment and not a line. And in fact, a quite complex four-dimensional construction where she also considers time. And this particular aspect I see already quite present in Daria's presentation, where she also really emphasizes the temporal dimension of certain controlling environment, which begin maybe in certain camp or a border, but actually it's expandable, and it's expandable very often in a way how networks are expandable themselves. So I will just skip another scholar and will bring us, and I will conclude very briefly with the case of Mariupol drama theater bombing, because that's where I kind of like explored this, like used this idea or worked with this idea of environment, terror environment first time. And that's what was particularly kind of like important, interesting for me, again, with this complex composition of the environment where a group of citizens, big group of citizens were kind of taken on or living in. And I worked with the Center for Spatial Technologies, Ukrainian group, and they graciously allowed me to work with the material that they collected. And the material was very much the interviews with the survival of the strike. And they conducted extremely interesting and well-organized immersive interviews with the survivors of that bombing, that with them, they in fact imagine the environment. They constructed this whole space by asking them about all the objects that they saw them, the use of those objects, the practices that were conducted there, but also what was happening with their devices and technologies, etc. One of the videos supplied by one of their research participants was this one. And this was the video of exactly the bombing. And that's someone just wanted to take a picture of something else. And at this particular moment, the explosion happens, the bomb was dropped, and the person pressed a different button and suddenly recorded the video, which became for me almost with this representation of that kind of mix of materialities, right? So inhabited by a data subject. And of course, this image always comes to mind, and I usually use it to illustrate the environmental dimension of this particular case. So you all, many of you, I should say, recognize probably this famous Maxar image that takes a photograph of Mariupol drama theater before before the bombing. And you can see how on both sides of the theater, the word "дети" is written by people who were there. And from the interviews, we know that people were extremely conflicting there in terms of whether they should or should not write the word "дети", because they did not know whether they would entice the violence by doing this, or whether they would protect from the violence by doing this. And in this, it's also kind of with this particular, subjectivity. That's what being subject means for me, because it's particularly, we were on this moment of this split, of this not knowing, of complete confusion and fear. So the decision was made, of course, to write the word. But what's interesting also here in this image is this how it shows exact awareness of this whole environment, right? So the letters was written big enough for the gaze of the pilot, which constitutes the upper edge of this, let's say, environment, right? So, and here you have like this whole volume that was territorialized in this particular case. And so in this sense, sometimes I write even about a certain, this environment includes those who are subjected to violence and those who commit the violence. So the environment actually locks them all in this almost impossible communicative assemblage. Communicative because we still see the exchange of information is happening there, exchange of messages, right? So, or at least a hope that this message would be reread and will protect those. We can speak even broader, right? So Ukraine's no-flight zone is also kind of shows this as a particular environment where something is happening, is not happening, right? So, and you can see that it's can be seen like this from this photograph. And finally, I just want to conclude by thinking about what happened after with this particular bombing, because I'm speaking to this complex environment where all elements, informational and let's say of other materialities converge. These environments proliferate and they remain kind of like this suppression continues after a particular event that we usually associate them with. Just like in Daria's presentation, is not about a particular event of filtration happening during like 2 months, right? So it proliferates and gets more complicated. So here is the square near Mariupol theater before it was reconstructed. And we can see how citizens who in fact experience the bombing, experience the extreme violence of war, occupation, and fear are also now being given a so-called humanitarian help. They distributed, the food is distributed to them, but they need to declare themselves. They need to come with passports and declare themselves as actually present there. And in a certain way, to be checked, to be identified. So food is distributed just near the ruin of the theater, where people in the video still speak about certain smell because it's still not clean. And at the same time, on these tracks, we also see the huge screens of Russian propaganda. If you listen to this video, which was obtained by, again, the Center of Special Technologies from Telegram channels occupied with Russian propaganda channels. So you could see how they say here at this particular moment, the Ukraine is already occupied by Poland and does not exist as the state anymore. And that's initial, and that's exactly what I, interpret as a terror environment. It's a kind of the layering of all these practices, materialities, and conditions in addition, right? So where data, information, disinformation, or even the signal reception is only a part of this kind of rich, scary complexity of war assemblage. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Svitlana. I a little bit ask about the not ask. I just want remind the people we have ability to put your question, and before this question we can discuss. I invite Nastya to provide their question or maybe some topic to discuss from all of your perspective about the data and sovereign. Thank you,
Yeah.
Svitlana and Nastya.
Thank you all for your incredibly important presentations. Yeah, and across your research, you each examine how digital technologies, social media, cyber warfare, different surveillance systems, filtration infrastructures reshape how states exert control and how people resist. And these technologies
don't just support the conflict, they transform its logic. And like from algorithmic visibility and biometric data collections, I don't know, cyberattacks, we see that a new landscape of digital war and occupation emerge. And I will ask a general question. Basically, in light of this technology transformation, how do you understand the change in meaning of sovereignty, especially in Ukraine's struggle?
Who do you want to go first? Maybe I can go for a little bit. I think it's a really good question, and I actually find the premise of, looking at data and power, but through the angle of sovereignty in particular, really interesting. Because I think in more conventional scholarship, which looks at digital sovereignty, it's almost always seen as something that states want to achieve. And there is obviously an ongoing discussion about, the different conceptions of sovereignty, whether it's whether having sovereignty means having the ability to control what's going on inside of part of the network that, it belongs to a particular state, or if your conception of sovereignty is actually trying to impose the same rules that already exist within your national, for instance, part of the network onto other parts of the network, which may or may not actually be part of your national territory or your national infrastructure, but nonetheless, you see that as part of the very idea of sovereignty. And I think, again, if I use that to reflect on what I've been talking about, and in particular then subvert it a little bit to talk about what happens when we look at sovereignty not from a state's point of view, but from a citizen point of view. I think the sovereignty idea is still there, but I think it's very clear that for citizens, and especially for citizens who are trying to resist an occupying force and do that on the ground, on land, but also to do that in the information space and in the infrastructure space, is that for citizens it's much more about the ability to kind of protect their own interpretations, of what it is they're fighting for instance, and what it is that it means to live through a war. So it's sovereignty not just over territory or borders, but it's not then just sovereignty of infrastructure, although that is very important because it's connected, but it's also sovereignty over meaning and sovereignty over what is being able to actually tell what is going on and being able to say that this knowledge is important and that it's important to listen to and to make space for it. So I think that there is that slow process of crystallization in terms of seeing sovereignty as something that is, again, multi-layered, and that it does require obviously protecting your territory and protecting the land, because again, territory has meaning insofar as it has human histories that are tied to it, and it has the personal meanings for people, but in addition to the material kind of part of living somewhere, having a history in a particular place. But I think it's there, but that also then is connected to the fact that it's not just physical or material territory, it's also the connections that you are able to maintain through digital or the digital spaces, messengers, phone conversations, Because what we see happening very often is one of the first things that Russian forces do when they occupy a territory physically is they try to either fully destroy or impose full control onto information infrastructure and communication infrastructure, with the aim of then also taking over the process of making meaning, rewriting history. So all of those layers are connected. And so the meaning for me on that citizen level is that all of these sovereignties are kind of part of the same conversation, and you can't really separate territorial sovereignty from information and infrastructural sovereignty from then kind of embodied lived experience of what it means to be a sovereign citizen, a person who is able to control and maintain their presence and their kind of maintain their integrity as a data subject, if we're moving to those terms online. That was a bit of a chaotic answer, but hopefully a good start.
Yeah.
Dasha, would you like to, or no? Okay. Yeah, sovereignty not necessarily, again, my topic, but it's one of the words that I also engage with. So let me also offer some speculations, right? So I would say this, if we understand sovereignty, just like the book says, right? So it's a authority, right? So it's a state power and authority over a particular territory. So very often I hear that we, or let's say in discussions in Ukraine, we almost have a certain understanding that people on the occupied territories are those, last placeholder of Ukrainian uh, sovereignty, right? And that's what I feel like is quite unfair, because when state itself acknowledges the loss of sovereignty, even though we do speak about so-called occupied territories, but as we now know, for a year now, the discussion really turned towards this understanding that for some time, maybe very long time, whether it's our lifetime, hopefully not so long, but Ukraine lost sovereign control over the territories. And it is with this understanding, with this very kind of strong, like, let's say, sociological, political understanding of the term, but also in relation to Ukraine's state, a kind of envisioning future action or doings, or how to even process what this current moment in terms of all these negotiations of what's going to happen. Should we fight for it, or should we actually give it up for some time, right? So what I want to actually acknowledge with this complexity and remove the burden from those who are there. In fact, I would really kind of redirect with this question and think about what happens, how more tragic and conflicted is and endangered the situation is of those data subjects who remain data subject, let's say, within Ukrainian data environment, but also became data subject of other state, right? So how much more complex and tragic the situation is in the situation of jeopardized sovereignty. And that's what a kind of, if I move this notion in the context of my research, that's where I would just, think more about what it means about living on this intersection of claimed and contested sovereignty, right? So, but still remaining the data subject of this bigger context.
Yeah, I must say that it is, I kind of like understand how this notion might be might be very much prominent in my work, and there is a lot of scholarship written on these questions of like data sovereignty, and it is one of the most kind of like obvious trajectories, but at the same time, I do not work with it precisely, and there is one of the lines of the way I try to think about sovereignty now is by looking into the way carceral geographers kind of like articulate the difference between the carceral state and and its apparatus, which can go beyond the formal sovereign boundaries of it. And how do I use it is I am kind of like trying to look, and in this way, there is this very interesting work by Lale Khalili, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies, where she looked into the way the carceral practices of United States or Israel, different liberal counterinsurgencies were organized where the boundaries of their operations were not bound to their territorial state, and the way the carceral space and but simultaneously looking into the very material infrastructures of the carceral spaces. They made, like, for instance, the very salaries workers of this detention centers received. She kind of like make this very interesting intervention into the understanding of the where the laws extent of the state, and in this way, there's kind of like an ongoing line which I do not really have a direct answer to, but I'm also interested in looking into the very material infrastructural ways in this space were organized, who and from where were deployed. I mean, the kind of like carceral infrastructure in the Donetsk Oblast, for instance.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answers. Unfortunately, we are tight in time, but I will still like discuss it with you. So we have questions from the audience, from the Katerina Bystritska, and she wrote that thank you for your valuable research and insights. And she asked, given that technical affordance of social media enable both visible civilian resistant knowledge production as well as sophisticated computational propaganda, and recognizing that traditional metrics of authenticity frequently fail, what new strategies should researchers and civilians employ to reliably differentiate participatory warframe from coordinated AI-generated influence campaigns? So, complex question.
And just very briefly comment and let other participants think. So yeah, I've been looking very briefly into a certain things that how propaganda and misinformation participate or unfolds with AI. I do not have enough research or data to speak about whether and to what extent these campaigns, for instance, are part of Russian strategy. Maybe not. Maybe someone knows better. But I was quite interested to read, I think last year, certain research done by MIT in terms of the response of the brain. And here we are going into almost neuroscience dimension, but that's where things are now, right? So the response of the brain to the statements generated by AI and generated by human. And the research shows that the brain is more activated, like literally lit up in a certain way, right? So those maps, brain maps, to AI generated sentence or content, where in fact, if you read it, you probably do not see much difference. And that's what, I will probably just contribute this particular thing. I didn't have more time to explore this, but I think we should look into this kind of research that has been happening already in terms of what this, beyond conscious perception, almost we are kind of going into realm of the neuropropaganda, right? So we can say like, is the propaganda, and I don't even know whether this is the word, but things like this are happening. We don't know enough about them. I mean, kind of certain things are coming out with AI researchers recently, but here it's literally just the experiment of one of the MIT AI lab research. So there is a difference of how body responds, right? So what it gives us, what kind of new means of control and regimes of power, and who is this power, right? So we obviously see it goes beyond the state very directly and immediately now we speak about AI and etc. But if we think about, again, future manipulation, that is obviously connected to this. I doubt something like this is run in the territories that we discuss now and through the communities. But who knows who makes certain experiments at this point. And as we know, the corporations have their stakes in this war, in scanning our resources, in, right, so hello, Palantir, and, at the same time, assisting, obviously, our military, right? So, and that's it again, I'm bringing this to this notion and the idea of the subject, who is at the same time liberated but incarcerated, confused but informed, empowered and disempowered, right? So, and this very complex position where we cannot not cooperate with certain agents, right? So, but we have to be very much aware what we are giving it and what futures it may design for us, the land, resources, and all sorts of things.
Yes, thank you, Svitlana. We have a lot of questions now. I think what we haven't enough time for answer for everything, but maybe we now have one more question directed to Tanya, and maybe if we ask audience if we have time more, and maybe even the speakers have the next plan for today, maybe we can ask about that. Nastya, can you ask this question about?
Yeah.
It's
a question from the Sahar Sagha. Thank you very much for all the presentations. They were really rich and thought-provoking. My question is for Tanya. I'm wondering whether the effective side of participatory communication shift across different platforms. Does the medium itself, for example, text versus images, influence the intensity of emotional engagement?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. There's definitely evidence of the fact that the even participatory communication, participant in resistance moves across different platforms, because obviously most people participating in any form of resistance or documentation or witnessing have presences across different platforms. The one thing that is kind of also obvious is that on every platform there is a slightly different mode of effective expression, because, well, partly because of the existing kind of platform cultures. So on Ukrainian Twitter, for instance, you will have certain forms of effective expression that are not just based on the difference between text and images or the shorter format of messages, but just because there is a certain way for Ukrainian Twitter to exist, and there are certain cultural specificities that have developed certain types of very dark humor that might not exist, for instance, on Instagram. And so even the same people or the same person having accounts on different platforms will do things differently, or will participate differently, or will express different types of emotions on different platforms in different contexts. So I think it's not just about the difference between, for instance, text and images. It's just platform cultures enable different types and welcome different types of effective expression. But I also think there is this something that I've been really fascinated with in examining how people, while producing knowledge about the war, how they have kind of also developed a very deep understanding of both the platform cultures, but also kind of the effect that certain decisions might have in terms of what you're sharing. And obviously, for a lot of people who are very active on Ukrainian social media platforms at the moment, a lot of those people have started their education in using these for civic activity during Euromaidan, or even before Euromaidan. So for a lot of people, this education, so to speak, goes back many, many years. But also, one of the things that I really appreciate, despite the fact that people have become very adept at using images and using personal testimony, using evidence as very impactful forms of provoking certain emotions, there is also the understanding that you have to be really careful with it. Firstly, because there are ethical considerations, because, if you're sharing images of extreme violence, or images of dead bodies, or, images of missile impacts, you have to be really thoughtful, because your aim is not only to make an impact emotionally, your aim is also not to harm. And your aim is also to protect other people, whether or not they are directly affected, or whether or not they're seeing something that happened in the next city over, or on the other side of the country. So there is a really interesting living conversation, living negotiation of the ethics of sharing very impactful emotional content. That is at the same time also very strategic. So people know that if they are choosing to post something very graphic, that they have thought long and hard about why they're posting it, why they're sharing it. And then people who choose to tell very personal stories, like their stories of escaping from occupation, or telling the stories of their time in Russian prisons as prisoners of war. They make these choices very consciously, understanding that even though it may be very difficult for them to share these things on social media, they know that it potentially will have a very direct, effective impact on people who are maybe not directly affected by the war, but might be moved, for instance, to change their mind, or to participate more actively in fundraising, or donating, or collecting money, or policy work, or diplomacy work. So I think one of the things that I found really fascinating is that this knowledge of this grammar of how to create information and knowledge that is very impactful in emotional terms is clearly a work in progress, and a lot of this work is kind of very public work, that people discuss these things in public, and there is a really interesting growing awareness of how that travels across platforms. Thank you.
Thank you, and I see. Thank you, Daria. Daria already answer for some question in the chat. If you, Alexandra, if you can look at that, and also I think what we also have the answer. It's like ask from Elsa mostly about the information, how to seek some information, how to find some information, for example, about the humanitarian corridors, or maybe you can advise some sources for that, and or maybe you can text something to the chat if you have some sources. And yes, I think, Mikhailo, we can finalize this meeting today. I I appreciate we stay here 2 hours. Thank you for this very deep discussion. It's a deep presentation. It's about what you do in your academic life. It's very important for us and for Ukrainians at first, because we need to have the evidence, not just an evidence. We need the academic knowledge about our history, what's very important for us. And thank you for participating today in this discussion. For any next, and also we invite you for next presentation. And I think Mikhailo tell about that. Thank you, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was indeed a heartbreaking and really strongly thought-provoking discussion and presentation today. I'm extremely grateful for all the speakers and all the participants. I think it's really important to talk about the things and present them, of course, especially to international audiences. And I also invite everyone to join us on the 10th of December for the next and probably the last DATAS event, public talk. We are going to talk about Southern Caucasus and digital means of oppression and propaganda used in different contexts of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, with researcher and artist Ilkin Husseinov, who also wanted to ask a question today, but unfortunately we are out of time. But still, you are really welcome to join us, and I will put the registration link into chat. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much to the experts, and wishing everyone to have safe rest of the day. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.